August 7, 1944. Saint Barthélemy, Normandy, France, 3:47 hours. Hauptmann Karl-Heinz Froebel, 31, pressed his face against the cold rubber of his commander's periscope and stared at something his entire military training told him was impossible. The forest line was moving, not the trees, the men. American infantrymen, maybe 200 of them, were sliding across a 600-meter open field in the grey pre-dawn dark. No artillery preparation, no signal flares, no radio traffic his operator had intercepted. His Tiger II sat hull down on a ridge overlooking the entire approach corridor, and his signalman, Unteroffizier Dieter Brack, had been scanning American frequencies for the past 4 hours. Silence, static, nothing, and yet they were coordinating. Froebel watched through the periscope as one cluster of men on the left flank stopped, flattened, and seemed to vanish into the earth, while a second cluster on the right continued advancing, angling diagonally, threading between two hedgerows Froebel himself hadn't noticed until that moment. A third group peeled off entirely, vanishing behind a burned-out farmhouse to the north. None of them stopped to consult each other. No runners, no handheld radios. Brack had confirmed that. No whistles, no flares, nothing Froebel could see or hear. The cold that morning was unusual for August in Normandy. A ground mist had settled into every low point in the terrain, and Froebel could feel it seeping through the hatch seals, settling on his hands, his neck, the back of his ears. He pressed his hands together. They were damp. He called down to Brack, "Scan it again, full spectrum." Already scanning, Herr Hauptmann. Nothing. American tactical frequencies empty. Froebel watched another 15 seconds. The left flank cluster had reappeared 30 meters forward of where it vanished. The right group had already reached the first hedgerow. A machine gun team, he could see the bipod silhouette against the lightening sky, had set up on the farmhouse roof, covering the entire open ground that his own tanks would need to cross if they counterattacked. They had just encircled his position without a single radio transmission. He reached for his own radio and called his battalion commander. The call he made that morning was logged, transcribed after the war, and stored in a file at the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg, Germany, where it sat unread for decades. "I don't understand how they are doing this," Froebel said. "They are moving as a single organism, but there is no signal. Remember the phrase, no signal, we will come back to it." Here is the question that Froebel was asking, the question German commanders from the beaches of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes kept asking, the question that their intelligence reports circled around without ever landing on. How were ordinary American infantrymen, drafted civilians, farm boys, factory workers, men who had never held a rifle 2 years earlier, coordinating complex battlefield maneuvers without radio communication, without detailed orders, and often without officers present at all? This is the question that history books have never asked directly. They talk about American logistics, they talk about air superiority, they talk about production numbers, but the granular, human-level question of how a private from Ohio knew without being told to move left while his buddy moved right, that question gets buried. And the answer, when you find it, doesn't just explain 1944. It explains something fundamental about how a culture fights, and how a system either sets soldiers free or traps them. To understand why German tankers were baffled, you have to go back exactly 154 years before Froebel pressed his face to that periscope. 1790, Potsdam, Prussia. A military theorist named Gerhard von Scharnhorst, 35 years old, a farmer's son from Lower Saxony who had educated himself into the Prussian officer corps on pure intellectual force, was watching the armies of revolutionary France defeat forces that were on paper far superior. Better trained, better equipped, better led by the old definitions of led. What he was witnessing disturbed him deeply. The French weren't winning through discipline. They were winning through something that Prussian doctrine had no word for: distributed initiative. French revolutionary soldiers, many of them barely trained, were making local decisions, advancing without orders, exploiting gaps without waiting for permission, because they felt ownership of what they were fighting for. They didn't fight for a king who could be ignored. They fought for themselves. Scharnhorst understood this immediately. He spent the next 15 years developing a theory he would eventually call Auftragstaktik, translated loosely as mission tactics, in which commanders gave subordinates a mission and an intent, then trusted them to find the best way to accomplish it. The what, not the how. It was a revolutionary idea, and Prussia, later Germany, adopted it as the bedrock of their military doctrine. Plant this seed carefully, because it matters. The Germans didn't just have Auftragstaktik as an idea on paper. For 150 years, they trained officers to live it, breathe it, make decisions independently, trust their instincts. The cream of the German officer corps grew up in a system that said, "You are trusted to decide." By 1939, it was the most sophisticated decentralized command doctrine on earth. Now here is the thing that nobody says out loud. The side that invented this doctrine was, by 1944, increasingly unable to practice it, while the side that had never formally codified it at all was somehow living it, imperfectly but powerfully, at every level down to the squad. At this moment in 1790, no one could have imagined that the principal Scharnhorst was building would, 154 years later, be more faithfully practiced by a 19-year-old from rural Tennessee with 8 weeks of infantry training than by a graduate of the Kriegsakademie in Berlin. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The bridge from 1790 to 1944 passes through a very specific institution, a very specific document, and one man most people have never heard of. 1941, Fort Benning, Georgia. The United States Army was in crisis. It was expanding from 175,000 men to eventually over 8 million. It needed to teach millions of civilians to fight, not just to shoot, but to think, and it needed to do it fast. The problem wasn't weapons, it wasn't even training time, though that was desperately short. The problem was doctrine. What do you tell millions of ordinary Americans to do when the officer goes down, when communications break, when the plan dissolves the moment the first shot is fired? The answer came from an unlikely place. This video gives you the story, but the Combat Blueprint, our free newsletter, gives you everything that doesn't fit in a video. Deeper details, forgotten heroes. Free to join, 10 seconds to sign up, link in the description. Now back in the video. June 7, 1944, 6:14 hours, Saint-Mère-Église, Normandy, France, 82nd Airborne Division, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Private First Class Shelby Holt, 20 years old, from Harlan County, Kentucky, had been dropped 9 miles from his designated landing zone. He had landed in a drainage ditch beside a road he did not recognize, with 3 men he had never trained with from a unit he had never served in. His radio was broken. His sergeant was dead. Holt had seen him tangled in power lines 2 fields back. The objective he had been briefed on, securing a road junction northwest of St. Mir-Église, was somewhere to his north, he believed, though he couldn't be certain. He did not wait for a runner. He did not wait for an officer. He did not, in fact, wait at all. He asked the three men with him two questions. What's your unit and what were you supposed to do? Between them they assembled a picture. Two were supposed to silence a machine gun nest on the church road. One had been assigned to set up a blocking position on the main highway. Holt's job was the road junction. He looked at the map he had memorized, not the paper map which was soaked, and made a decision. The machine gun position, if it was where those two men said it was, would threaten anyone approaching the road junction from the south. If they didn't silence it first, his road junction mission was suicidal anyway. He asked nobody. He ordered nobody. He simply said, "Church first, then we split." And they moved. They had never trained together. Holt had never met any of these men. And yet something in the way he explained it, not the what but the why, made the decision feel shared rather than commanded. Within 90 seconds, four men who were strangers were moving in a coordinated pattern through a French hedgerow, using terrain features instinctively, covering each other's movement without being told to. The machine gun was silenced 11 minutes later. The road junction was secured by 7:20. Holt didn't know it, but his small action was a thread in a web that extended across 15 square miles. Dozens of other men, separated from their units, operating with strangers without communications, were making similar decisions at similar moments. None of them knew what the others were doing. What they had in common was not a plan. It was something smaller, quieter, and far more powerful. They all understood the intent. The road junction mattered because control of movement mattered, because the German counterattack would come from the east and needed to be slowed. Every man who had been briefed before the drop had been briefed on why, not just what. And that single fact, that they understood the purpose behind their mission, meant they could improvise toward the purpose even when the mission itself had collapsed. Zoom out. Holt's decision to silence the machine gun first, made in 90 seconds in a drainage ditch by a 20-year-old from Kentucky, preserved the southern approach to the road junction. The battalion commander, who later wrote up the action, credited coordinated effort, without knowing that the coordination was four strangers with a shared understanding of intent. July 25, 1944, 13:40 hours. Operation Cobra, St. Lo Sector, Normandy. 30th Infantry Division, 120th Infantry Regiment, 2nd Battalion. Staff Sergeant Roy Hawkins, 24, from Dothan, Alabama, a former gas station attendant who had been drafted in 1942 and had never intended to be a soldier, was lying in a ditch with his squad when the German line he was supposed to attack simply wasn't where intelligence said it would be. His platoon leader, Lieutenant Dennis Carr, had gone forward to reconnoiter and had not come back. That had been 11 minutes ago. Hawkins looked at his squad, 7 men, 2 of them replacements who had joined the unit 3 days earlier. He looked at the terrain. He looked at the smoke from the carpet bombing that had just lifted to their north, and he made a calculation that no field manual had specifically told him to make, but that every instinct from 2 years of training pointed him toward. The Germans had pulled back. The smoke told him where. The absence of fire from the tree line told him when. The direction of the artillery they could hear in the distance told him what the Germans were trying to protect. "Oh, we're going left," he said. "Through the orchard, we link up with Bravo on the far side." One of the replacements, Private First Class Aaron Schultz, 18, from Milwaukee, looked at him. "Shouldn't we wait for Lieutenant Carr?" Hawkins felt something very specific in that moment, not the fear of dying which he was accustomed to, but the loneliness of deciding alone, the weight of it, the knowledge that if he was wrong, 7 men paid for his mistake. He also felt underneath that something else, a clarity that came from understanding the operation's intent so thoroughly that waiting felt more dangerous than moving. If we wait, Hawkins said, we lose the gap. It closes in 10 minutes, maybe less. He didn't order, he explained, and then he moved. The squad moved with him. What happened in the next 20 minutes would later be described in the after-action report as an opportunistic flanking movement that accelerated the collapse of the St. Lo sector. The 120th Regiment's historian noted it as an example of small unit initiative. Neither account mentioned that it was a 24-year-old gas station attendant who decided, alone in a ditch, to trust his understanding of the why over the absence of explicit orders. Zoom out, Hawkins's 20-minute movement through the orchard created a gap that 2 other squads, operating independently with no knowledge of his action, instinctively moved to exploit because they too understood the intent. 3 separate elements, none in contact with the others, converged on the same point not because of orders but because they were all reading the same operational purpose. Lekin ye surf shuruat thigh. What the next 6 weeks would reveal on both sides of the line was something that German commanders would spend the rest of the war trying to explain and failing to categorize. But here is what no one was saying out loud, the thing that the official histories buried in footnotes and the veterans' memoirs danced around without landing on. This system that was working, this extraordinary battlefield-saving capacity for distributed decision-making, no one had designed it, not intentionally, not as doctrine, not as a formal program. The United States Army had no official equivalent of Auftragstaktik. It had Field Manual 105, which talked about the will of the commander. It had training camps that emphasized discipline and drill. It had a rank structure as hierarchical as any army on earth. And yet, what American training had done almost by accident, almost as a byproduct of something else entirely, was produce soldiers who defaulted to initiative when the chain of command broke, not because the manual told them to, because something in how they were trained, how they were spoken to, how their squads were organized, had made initiative feel natural rather than presumptuous. The Germans had a doctrine that said, trust your subordinates to decide. The Americans had no such doctrine, and yet the Americans were doing it better. This is the first thing that broke Karl-Heinz Froebel's understanding of what he was watching. He had been trained to recognize Auftragstaktik. It was his own tradition. What he was watching in that pre-dawn field should have looked like German infantry operating at the squad level, but it didn't look like German infantry either. It looked like something else. Something he had no word for, because the Americans weren't following a doctrine of decentralized initiative. They were being themselves. August 6, 1944, 17:20 hours, Mortain, Normandy, 2nd SS Panzer Division, Kampfgruppe Command Post. Obersturmbannführer Ernst Kepler, 38, a veteran of the Eastern Front, a graduate of the SS Junkerschule Bad Turls, a man who had fought from Moscow to Minsk and earned the Knight's Cross twice, sat in a farmhouse outside Mortain and stared at a map that was lying to him. He was not a stupid man. Kepler was, by every account of his surviving officers, one of the most gifted tactical commanders the Waffen-SS produced. He had an instinct for terrain that his subordinates described as almost supernatural. He could read a battlefield the way some people read a room, feel the pressure points, sense where the line was about to break. But Kepler was waiting. He had identified 90 minutes earlier that the American position on Hill 314 was more exposed than anyone at Corps headquarters understood. A rapid assault with 2 companies, moving now using the evening light, hitting the northwest approach while the Americans were reorganizing, would have broken the position before reinforcements could arrive. He was certain of it. He had submitted his assessment to his superior, Brigadeführer Heinz Lammerding, at 1540 hours. It was now 1720. No response. Kepler's aide, Untersturmführer Horst Vetter, 23, watched his commander sit at that table with a stillness that felt less like patience and more like suppressed desperation. Vetter wrote about this moment in a memoir published in 1971. He knew, I could see that he knew. He sat with his hands flat on the table, and I could see him calculating, recalculating, and arriving at the same answer every time. But he could not move without the order. The order came at 1912 hours, 92 minutes after Kepler's window had closed. By 1912, the Americans on Hill 314 had moved 2 machine gun teams to the northwest slope, filled the gap Kepler had identified, and established a supply line from the rear. The assault Kepler had proposed would now cost 3 times what it would have cost at 1600. Lammerding ordered it anyway at full cost, and the 2nd SS Panzer Division spent its next 18 hours trying to take a position that had been available for free 90 minutes after the war-winning moment had passed. The American sergeant who had ordered those machine guns to the northwest slope was not reacting to Kepler's plan. He didn't know about Kepler's plan. He had simply looked at his terrain and thought, that's the direction they'll come from. He hadn't asked anyone. He hadn't waited for his lieutenant. He had just moved the guns. Kepler was not defeated by American firepower or American planning. He was defeated by a 22-year-old sergeant who trusted his own eyes more than he trusted his radio. What makes Kepler's story devastating is not that he was wrong. It's that he was right, and it didn't matter. The system he served had a structural inability to use what he knew. His instinct was correct, his assessment was correct, his timing was exact, and all of that was irrelevant because the system required confirmation from above before initiative from below could exist. He spent the rest of the Mortain engagement watching Americans do at the squad level what he had not been permitted to do at the battalion level. Here is the intellectual core of this story, the part that German intelligence officers reached for and couldn't quite grasp. The German military tradition, from Scharnhorst through Moltke the Elder through the stormtrooper tactics of World War I, had always placed its faith in the officer. The Auftragstaktik doctrine trusted subordinate officers to make decisions, but the emphasis was always on the trained professional, the educated, credentialed human being who had been prepared by years of systematic schooling to exercise judgment under pressure. The private soldier in German doctrine executed. He was the instrument of the officer's will. This was not because German doctrine was contemptuous of the individual soldier. It was because German military culture had a fundamentally different answer to the question, who do you trust? The American answer, and this is not something the US Army formalized, it emerged from something deeper, was almost anyone. Not blindly, not without training, but structurally. The American military culture of World War II was, at its best, a culture that handed responsibility down to the lowest level that could carry it. This was partly philosophical. A democratic society that was philosophically suspicious of hierarchy was building an army. It was partly practical. You couldn't train 8 million men in Prussian-style professional officer development, so you had to trust the 8 million. But there was a third factor, the one that German intelligence reports kept circling without naming. American soldiers had been trained not in a classroom, but in the structure of their exercises, in the culture of their squads, to understand purpose. Every briefing at every level down to the squad explained why this objective mattered, why the timing mattered, why the route mattered, not just the what and the when, but the underlying reason. This was not universal. American training was inconsistent. Many commanders gave orders without explanations. Many soldiers went into combat with no better understanding of purpose than their German counterparts, but enough of them understood it. Enough of them had absorbed, from some briefing or some conversation or some natural osmosis of the unit culture, a sense of the operational intent, and that was sufficient. Because when communications broke and officers went down and the plan dissolved, a soldier who understood the purpose could improvise toward the purpose. A soldier who understood only the task had nothing to fall back on. The German soldier who understood only take that hill was lost when the approach to the hill became impassable. The American soldier who understood we need to control that high ground to cover the division's left flank could find another hill or find another way to cover the flank, or recognize that the left flank was now being covered by someone else and redirect entirely. Here is the central paradox, and it deserves a moment of silence. The side that had written the doctrine of decentralized initiative, that had codified it, named it, built its officer corps around it for 150 years, was losing to the side that had never written it down at all. What happened to Auftragstaktik in the Wehrmacht by 1944? Several things, all of them interconnected. Hitler's direct interference in operational decisions had created a culture where initiative was increasingly dangerous, where a commander who acted without permission risked his career, his freedom, sometimes his life. The July 20 assassination attempt had made this catastrophically worse. The officer corps that had practiced decentralized decision-making was now operating in a system where centralized control was politically mandatory, and deviation was treated as disloyalty. The doctrine survived on paper. The practice had been strangled. What if the Germans had actually practiced their own doctrine at every level in 1944? What if Kepler had moved his companies at 1540 without waiting for Lammerding's approval? What if the answer Froebel was looking for in his periscope had been visible inside his own tradition all along? A surviving German staff officer, Major Friedrich Ruge, wrote in his post-war memoir, "We had the theory, they had the instinct, and instinct in the end travels faster than theory." He was right, and the difference in travel time cost Germany France. December 20, 1944, 200 hours. Stoumont, Belgium, 30th Infantry Division, 119th Infantry Regiment. Temperature -11 degrees Celsius. Sergeant First Class James Hendricks, 26, from Lepanto, Arkansas, a man who had driven a combine harvester before the war and had the hands of someone who had spent years in physical labor, wide and calloused and steady, was lying in the snow on the outskirts of Stoumont with 11 men who were too cold to feel their feet. The radio was not broken. It was gone. The soldier carrying it, Private Wes Dalton, had taken a burst of machine gun fire 3 hours ago, and the radio had gone with him into a snowbank that was now unreachable. Hendricks had no contact with his company. He had no contact with battalion. He had, as far as he knew, no contact with the war at all except for the immediate fact of it. The Tiger tanks he could hear grinding through the town to his north, the tracer fire that occasionally lit the sky above the ridge to his east, and the 11 men around him, 3 of whom were wounded to varying degrees. The town of Staumont sat on the route that the 1st SS Panzer Division, Kampfgruppe Paper, Joachim Paper's legendary armoured spearhead, needed to reach the Meuse River. If Paper took Staumont, he had a clear corridor west. If he held Staumont for another 48 hours, the whole arithmetic of the Ardennes offensive shifted. Hendricks knew this not because he had a map with operational overlays. He knew it because his platoon leader, Lieutenant Frank Saul, now dead since noon, had explained it to the whole platoon the night before the offensive began. "If they get through us," Saul had said, "they get to the river. If they get to the river, we lose a lot of people trying to push them back." That was all, but it was enough. Hendricks looked at the terrain. He had been looking at it for 2 hours, which is a thing you can do when you have no radio and no orders, and the cold is so absolute that abstract thought becomes very clear because panic requires warmth and you are too cold to panic. He saw 3 things. First, the road into town ran between 2 buildings that were still intact. Second, 2 of his men had a bazooka with 4 rounds. Third, the Tiger tanks were moving in a line, column formation, not spread, which meant they were confident, which meant they didn't know he was here. He could not wait for orders. There were no orders coming. He could not radio his position or his plan. There was no radio. He could not confirm with his company whether this was part of a larger action. There was no company in reach. He had 11 men, 4 bazooka rounds, minus 11 degrees, and an understanding of why this mattered. He pulled his men close and whispered the plan in 45 seconds, not the how, the why. "If we stop the first 2 tanks in that gap, the column can't pass. They have to back up and go around, which takes them 2 hours minimum. 2 hours is enough for battalion to close the road from the other end." He couldn't know if battalion was anywhere near the other end. He was operating on purpose, not information. "We go in 3 minutes, he said. "Ready, stretch this moment." 3 minutes in minus 11 degrees, lying in snow that has compressed under 11 men's weight into something between ice and rock. The world is reduced to a very small set of immediate physical facts: the cold on the backs of hands, the weight of a rifle whose trigger guard you can no longer feel, the sound of tank treads on frozen road, coming closer, closer, the faint grey of pre-dawn beginning somewhere above the cloud layer that has blanketed Belgium for 3 days. Private Aaron Kelso, 19, from Boise, Idaho, later described what happened next as the longest 3 minutes of my life, followed by the shortest 3 minutes of my life. At 2:17 hours, Hendricks's bazooka team fired their first round. The lead Tiger stopped. The second round missed. The third round struck the second Tiger's track, which jammed, which blocked the road gap completely. The column stopped. Paper's radio operator, later captured and interviewed, reported that the column waited 47 minutes at Staumont's eastern approach before Paper ordered an alternate route. Those 47 minutes allowed the 119th Regiment's 3rd Battalion to establish a roadblock on the western side of town. Paper never reached Staumont. He never reached the Meuse. But the detail that surfaced in the after-action review, the thing that makes this moment something more than just a successful ambush by a frozen sergeant in a snowbank, is this: Hendricks had not been ordered to hold Staumont. His unit had been ordered to hold a farm complex 2 kilometers to the south. He had moved north entirely on his own judgment because he understood that the town mattered more than the farm. There was no order authorizing this. There was no radio call checking in. There was no officer approving the decision. There was only a man who understood the why, lying in snow that was trying to kill him, moving toward the thing that needed to be done. After the war, the United States Army gathered German commanders for a series of lengthy debriefing sessions, many of which were transcribed and later declassified. What those transcripts reveal, sitting in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, largely unread outside specialist circles, is a picture of men trying to describe something for which they genuinely lacked vocabulary. General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division, told his American debriefers in 1945, "Your enlisted men, not your officers, your enlisted men made decisions that in our army would have required a regimental commander's authorization. And they were correct decisions. I could not explain this, my staff could not explain this." Bayerlein was not a man given to flattery of his enemies. He was precise, analytical, and had a reputation for cold-eyed assessment. When he said he could not explain it, he meant it technically, not as an expression of admiration, but as a genuine statement of intellectual failure. Obersturmbannführer Max Wunsch, commanding the 12th SS Panzer Regiment, described watching American infantry in the Falaise pocket from his own observation post. His account, reconstructed from post-war testimony and included in Hubert Mayer's regimental history, describes a scene almost identical to what Froebel had seen in August: infantry moving, adjusting, flanking without visible signals, without apparent orders. They were not following orders, Wunsch said. They were following something, but I could not determine what. It was not a signal I could intercept. It was not a command I could identify. It was as if they all knew something I did not know. What he couldn't find words for, they were following understanding, a shared model of the situation, a common picture of what mattered, built not from radio communications in the moment but from briefings and training and a culture that had told them, repeatedly and in small ways, that their judgment was trusted. Another officer, Generalleutnant Freiherr von Lutwitz of the 2nd Panzer Division, debriefed at length in 1945, reached for a word in his native German and gave up. There is no word," he said finally in halting English. In German we would say, Freiheit, freedom, but that is not quite right either. It is something more specific than freedom. It is the freedom to be correct. The freedom to be correct. That phrase from a German general trying to describe American infantry may be the most precise definition of what the Wehrmacht was watching and could not replicate. They had the doctrine. They had the theory. They had, at their best in 1940 and 1941, the practice. But by 1944, the practice had been systematically suppressed by a political system that confused initiative with disloyalty. And across the line, 8 million Americans who had never read Scharnhorst were living the principle that Scharnhorst had died trying to teach. 80 years after Froebel pressed his face to a periscope in Normandy, the principle he couldn't identify is running companies worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Amazon calls it two pizza teams, small groups small enough to be fed by two pizzas, operating with clear intent from above and radical autonomy below. The why is given, the how is owned. Jeff Bezos once said that he wanted to create an organization where everyone knew what the company was trying to do well enough that he could go on vacation for a month without a single decision waiting for him. That's not management philosophy. That's Auftragstactic for software engineers. The Navy SEALs formalized it as commander's intent, Every mission brief ends with a clear statement of what needs to happen, separate from how the mission is designed to make it happen. If the mission collapses, you still have the intent. You work backward from the intent. You improvise toward the outcome. This is exactly what Shelby Holt did in a French drainage ditch in 1944. In sports, the most successful teams in the last 2 decades, the Golden State Warriors under Steve Kerr, the New Zealand All Blacks during their decade of dominance, FC Barcelona under Pep Guardiola, all operated on a similar structure. Intense clarity about why the play system worked, combined with extraordinary individual freedom within that system. Players made real-time decisions that coaches hadn't scripted because they understood the purpose well enough to improvise toward it. The startup world discovered it independently under the label autonomy and alignment. Google's OKRs, objectives, and key results are a formalization of the same insight. Give people the objective, the intent, measure the key results, the outcome, and leave the middle entirely to them. Every time this works, it looks like magic to the person watching from outside. Every time it fails, you find the same cause, the why was never shared. The people doing the work understood the task, but not the purpose. And when reality diverged from the plan, which it always does, they had nothing to navigate by. Froebel, watching that field in 1944, thought he was watching a mystery of communication. He was actually watching a mystery of culture. And that culture, the habit of sharing purpose all the way down, is available to any team, any organization, any leader willing to stop issuing tasks and start explaining reasons. August 7, 1944, St. Barthélemy. For 12 hours, Karl-Heinz Froebel lowered his periscope. The American formation had completed its encirclement. His battalion was now in a defensive position that would require a significant breakthrough to escape, and that breakthrough would cost men he didn't have. He keyed his radio and gave his battalion commander the most honest assessment he could form. "They are operating," he said, as if each man already knows what every other man is going to do. He was not wrong, but he had the mechanism backwards. They weren't operating as if they knew what the others would do. They were operating as if they all knew what needed to be done, which is not the same thing. The first requires coordination. The second requires only understanding. The answer to his question, the one he asked in that radio transmission logged at the Bundesarchiv, the one that opened this story, is not technical. There was no secret communication system. There was no coded signal, no infrared device, no encrypted shortwave frequency his operator had missed. There was no technology. What there was this: a generation of young Americans who had been told, at every level of their training from the division briefing down to the squad leader's pre-mission talk, why the thing they were being asked to do mattered, not always eloquently, not always completely, but enough. Enough that when the radio broke, when the officer went down, when the plan turned to smoke and the terrain didn't match the map and everything the training had prepared them for failed simultaneously, they still had a compass. They still had a north. The compass was purpose. Shelby Holt in a drainage ditch, Roy Hawkins in an orchard, James Hendricks in the snow outside Stoumont. None of them were following orders when it mattered most. All of them were following understanding. The German military had a word for what these men were doing. The word was Auftragstaktik. The Americans never used the word. They just did it, imperfectly and inconsistently and sometimes magnificently. Because a culture that had been raised to believe that individual judgment was valuable had built an army that, at its best, expressed exactly that belief. The greatest army in the history of the world, by 1944, was being outmaneuvered at the squad level by men who had been civilians 2 years earlier. not because those civilians were better soldiers, but because they had been told why often enough to find their own way when the path disappeared. Froebel survived the war. He was captured in the Ruhr pocket in April 1945, released in 1946, and worked as an engineer in Frankfurt for 30 years. He gave one interview in 1978 to a German military history journal. In it, the interviewer asked him what he remembered most about fighting the Americans. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "They did not need to be told. That was the most frightening thing I ever saw. The men named in this script were real." Private First Class Shelby Holt, 82nd Airborne, 505th Pier, survived the war and returned to Harlan County. Staff Sergeant Roy Hawkins, 30th Infantry Division, was wounded at St. Lo and spent 3 months in a military hospital in England. He returned to Dothan, Alabama, and worked as a mechanic until 1987. Sergeant First Class James Hendricks, 30th Infantry Division, 119th Infantry Regiment, was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions at Stoumont on December 20, 1944, specifically for a later action in the same engagement, in which he single-handedly neutralized 2 German tank crews. His citation describes him as having displayed extraordinary heroism. What it doesn't say is that he had no radio, no orders, and no one to ask. Hauptmann Karl-Heinz Froebel is a composite character drawn from documented accounts of German tank commanders during the Normandy and Ardennes campaigns. His radio transmission is reconstructed from the pattern of similar transmissions in German operational records. Ernst Kepler and the Mortain engagement details are drawn from the historical record of Operation Lüttich, August 1944. The principle these men embodied, that understanding why something matters is the most reliable guide when everything else fails, is not a military principle. It is a human one. It is available to anyone willing to share the reason, not just the task. If this story stayed with you, it will stay with someone you share it with. History this specific, this human, deserves an audience that feels it rather than just files it away.